The sun had just begun to dip below the rooftops of Lexington's quiet suburbs, casting long shadows on manicured lawns and white picket fences. The kind of evening where nothing unusual ever happens, or so people like to think. A black SUV glided silently down Sycamore Lane. It was the kind of vehicle that said just enough, sleek, polished, but unassuming. Inside sat a woman, alone, calm, composed. She didn't tap her fingers to music. She didn't glance at her phone. She drove like someone who knew where she was going, and more importantly, who she was. Danielle Monroe, 42 years old, is an African American wearing a navy blue blazer that hugged her shoulders with quiet authority. Her eyes were sharp but tired from a long day. She had just left a federal meeting in D.C., navigating conversations about national threats and systemic reforms like she had done 1,000 times before. But on this road, at this hour, none of that mattered. A sudden flash of red and blue pierced the tranquility. A siren, shrill and unnecessary, cut through the warm spring air. Danielle's gaze flicked to the rearview mirror. A Lexington PD cruiser was tailing her now, lights spinning as if they had caught a fugitive. She hadn't run a light. She hadn't sped. And yet, she was being pulled over. Danielle eased the SUV to the curb, her movements precise, controlled. She didn't sigh. She didn't swear. Instead, she reached for her window controls with the kind of steady hand that came from years of knowing this moment could come. Not because she was guilty, but because she was visible. The officer approached slowly. Male, white, mid-30s. A nameplate read, Holt. No greeting, no explanation. Just a glance into her vehicle, followed by a line delivered like a cold fact. License and registration. Security check. Danielle turned her head slightly, just enough to meet his eyes, not with defiance, but with clarity. She handed over the documents without a word, because she knew how this worked, because women like her, even when they run federal agencies, even when they hold the nation's highest security clearance, are taught one thing early in life: your dignity must never provoke their discomfort. As Officer Holt walked back to his patrol car, glancing repeatedly at her license, something in his posture changed. His back stiffened, his brows furrowed. He didn't know yet, not who she was, not what she represented. Not what line he was about to cross, but he would, soon. Because Danielle Monroe isn't just a regular citizen, she's the director of the FBI, and tonight, she's not the one on trial. The system is. There's a language in law enforcement that isn't taught in any academy. It isn't written in handbooks or shouted over radios. It's spoken through the eyes, through silence, through tone. And Danielle Monroe knew it fluently. She had studied it not from behind a badge, but from behind the desk where badges are reported. She knew how to walk, how it stood, how it breathed. And in this moment, sitting in her car on a quiet Kentucky street, she could feel it being rehearsed outside her window like a poorly written play. Officer Travis Holt returned, his boots hitting the asphalt with the rhythm of someone convinced the ground itself owed him respect. In his hand, he held Danielle's license and registration like a riddle he couldn't solve. He didn't hand them back. Instead, he stared at her, eyes narrowed, jaw tight. "I'm going to need to see your ID," he said, his voice clipped, artificially calm. Danielle blinked once, slowly. "You have my license, officer," she replied, her tone light but unyielding. "That is my ID." Holt's lips curled into something between a smirk and a sneer. "Not your driver's license. Your federal ID, something that shows who you really are." That word, really, hung in the air like smoke. Danielle tilted her head slightly. "And what makes you think there's something else I need to prove?" Holt didn't answer. He didn't need to. His eyes had already answered. It was the glance, that half-second flick from her face to her skin, to her car and back again. A glance that screamed, "You don't belong in this zip code." Not in that vehicle, not with that tone. And the tone, that was the second strike. She hadn't spoken with fear. She hadn't whispered. She hadn't deferred. That, to him, was suspicious. "I'm just doing my job," Holt said, the line practiced to the point of being hollow. Danielle folded her hands in her lap. "And I'm exercising my rights." The standoff was quiet. No shouting, no sudden movements. Just the heavy, invisible weight of one man's discomfort colliding with one woman's presence. Holt took a breath, one of those short inhales that pretends to summon patience. "You fit a description," he finally said. Danielle raised an eyebrow. "Description of what?" "Suspicious vehicle, black SUV. Driven by a solo female. Looked nervous." "Nervous?" she echoed, her tone sharpening just enough to cut without slicing. He shrugged. "You looked tense." Danielle smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I tend to look that way when I'm followed without cause." It was too much. Not the words. The calm. Men like Holt didn't know what to do with calm. They were trained for chaos, raised on images of resistance, of threat. But when their power was met with composure instead of compliance, it made them itch. And Officer Holt was beginning to itch. "I don't appreciate the attitude," he said finally. "I don't appreciate the profiling," Danielle responded. His jaw twitched. Then came the shift. The one Danielle had seen before, dozens of times. His hand moved to his belt, not to draw, not yet, but to rest. To remind, the silent statement, "You may have words, I have weapons." "You don't tell me how to do my job," he said. "And you don't get to bend the law just because you're uncomfortable," she replied. It was subtle, but something broke in him right then. Maybe it was the fact that she didn't flinch. Maybe it was the realization that he wasn't in control. Or maybe, just maybe, it was that somewhere, deep down, he already suspected who she was. But he couldn't back down now. So he leaned in. "People like you," he said slowly, "should think twice before acting like they run the place." Danielle didn't move. Didn't blink. She let the words sit in the air between them. Heavy. Ugly, revealing, and then softly, "People like me." Holt didn't reply. "Because there's no answer that doesn't indict the speaker," she continued. "You asked me to identify myself." "I did. You asked for registration. I gave it. Now you're asking for more. Why, Officer Holt? What exactly are you hoping to find?" He stared at her like he was trying to dig an answer from her pupils. And Danielle realized something. He wasn't afraid of her. He was afraid of what she represented. Control he couldn't reclaim. Authority he couldn't override. And a mirror he couldn't escape. "I think," she said slowly, "that you're not looking for a reason to trust me. You're looking for an excuse to arrest me." Holt stepped back, startled by the accuracy. "I suggest," Danielle said, her voice firm now, "you think very carefully about your next step." The pause that followed was long. Too long. The sun had disappeared. The street had dimmed. But what was unfolding here wasn't about visibility. It was about exposure. Because what Officer Holt didn't realize, what he was about to learn in the harshest possible way, was that his actions weren't just being recorded on a dashcam. They were about to be recorded in history. And Danielle Monroe? She wasn't going to let him edit the truth. There are moments when power doesn't need to shout. It just shifts its weight. For example, when Officer Travis Holt adjusted his stance slightly, he let his right hand rest on the holster at his hip. Not a draw. Not even a threat. Just a reminder. Danielle Monroe saw it. She always saw it. Because when you are a black woman in America, especially one who outranks half the men who think they can intimidate you, you learn to read body language like scripture. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She simply let the silence swell between them, thick and unmoving, until it demanded to be acknowledged. Holt's fingers drummed once on the hard shell of his sidearm. "You think you can tell me how to run a stop?" he asked, not expecting an answer. Danielle tilted her head just slightly. "I think the Constitution already did." That should have been the end of it. A de-escalation. A boundary is clearly drawn, but men like Holt didn't like lines they didn't draw themselves. And he didn't come here tonight to follow a rule book. He came to enforce something unspoken, the belief that people like him could bend the law to their discomfort, and people like her should bend with it. "You've got an answer for everything, huh?" he muttered. "I have facts," Danielle replied. "They tend to speak for themselves." His grip tightened. This wasn't about the car anymore. Or the ID, or even her demeanor. This was about the nerve, that she could sit there, calm and correct, while he stood there, armed and unraveling. "You think that suit means something to me?" he asked. "That calm voice? That polished tone?" "I've dealt with people like you before." Danielle met his eyes. "No," she said quietly. "You haven't." And that's when it happened. The shift, not in her, in him. Because there are two types of power in a confrontation, the kind that swings first and the kind that lets you run out of rope. Officer Holt was nearing the end of his. "I need you to step out of the vehicle," he said suddenly, voice clipped. Danielle's eyebrows lifted slightly, not in surprise but in calculation. "On what grounds?" "I said step out." "Officer Holt," she said, voice even, "do you have probable cause to escalate this stop?" His eyes narrowed. "That's how you want to play it?" Danielle unbuckled her seatbelt slowly, not in compliance but in precision. Every motion was measured, and every breath was accounted for. Because if there was one thing she knew better than the law, it was the choreography of survival. She opened the door and stepped out, heels meeting pavement with the certainty of someone who had walked through Senate hearings, foreign intelligence briefings, and closed-door security briefings that most men wouldn't survive. But none of those rooms felt as dangerous as this one. Holt took a step closer. She could smell the tension in his breath. Part sweat, part fear, part ego, trying to hold its last breath of control. "You have a weapon on you?" he asked, hand still near his own. Danielle kept her voice firm. "No." "You mind if I check?" "I do, actually," she said. "Without probable cause or suspicion, you do not have the right to search my person." He blinked. Somewhere, in the echo chamber of his mind, the reality began to crack. She knew the law better than he did. He hated that. "You trying to make a scene?" he asked, his voice lower now. "No," she said. "I'm trying to prevent one." But it was already too late. His pride had outpaced his reason. At that moment, pride made a decision that the law could not justify. He unclipped the holster. Danielle didn't flinch. Instead, she did something Officer Holt didn't expect. She spoke into the silence, not to him, but to the open air behind him. "My phone is recording," she said. There was no camera in her hand, no visible device, just the possibility. and possibility is a dangerous thing for men who depend on darkness. Holt paused. "Is that a threat?" he asked. "No," she said. "It's documentation." He hesitated. And hesitation, for once, was mercy. Because across the street, porch lights were beginning to flicker on, curious faces peeking from windows. A jogger slows their pace. The neighborhood was starting to watch. And men like Holt don't abuse power in plain view. They whisper it. They hide it. They hope no one else notices. But now it was visible, tangible, real. Danielle took a breath. "I suggest," she said, voice like glass, clear, smooth, and sharp, "you step back. Before you add unlawful arrest to your growing list of mistakes." He didn't move, but the gun stayed in its holster, barely. And then, for the first time, he asked a question. "Who are you?" Danielle's answer came slowly, deliberate. "Someone you'll regret provoking." Then, without another word, she reached into her blazer, calmly, deliberately, and pulled out her credentials. Not a badge, a federal seal. Embossed, laminated, final. Federal Bureau of Investigation Director Danielle Monroe. Silence. Real silence. Not the quiet before a storm. The quiet after one. Officer Holt didn't say a word, because now he knew. And now he couldn't undo what he'd just done. Officer Travis Holt stood still, eyes locked on the words he could no longer deny. Federal Bureau of Investigation Director Danielle Monroe. His mouth opened slightly, a breath taken to speak, and then nothing. No apology, no explanation, no protocol to follow. Just silence. It was the kind of silence that didn't protect him anymore, because now he was the one out of uniform, stripped not of his badge, but of his illusion of control. Danielle Monroe didn't smile. She didn't gloat. Her expression remained unchanged, as if the reveal of her title was never the point, because it wasn't. The point was accountability, and it was long overdue. She took one small step closer, her body poised not to intimidate but to declare, "We are not backing down anymore." "I'd like you to call your supervisor," she said quietly. Holt blinked. "Ma'am, Call," she repeated, calm but razor sharp. "Your supervisor." Now. The word now didn't rise in volume. It didn't need to. Because real authority doesn't have to yell, it simply removes the option of being ignored. Reluctantly, Holt reached for the radio on his shoulder. "Dispatch, this is Unit 2 to 9. I need Sergeant Halbrook at my location." His voice cracked slightly, barely noticeable to most, but Danielle heard it. Not because she wanted to, but because she'd heard it before. From officers realizing they went too far. From men who only began to understand the weight of their badge after they used it to crush instead of protect. Danielle stepped away, lifting her phone. This call wasn't about help, it was about the record. She pressed the familiar number. It rang only once. "Monroe," came the voice on the other end, clipped, alert. "This is a situation," Danielle said calmly, turning her body so Holt could still hear every word. "I've just been stopped without cause by a local officer. He escalated, initiated a confrontation, and placed his hand on his weapon. I need the local sheriff on site immediately." "Location?" She rattled off the street name, cross street, and time with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. Not from behind the wheel, but from behind the desk where men like Holt are investigated. "We're dispatching Sheriff Thomas Bryant now," said the voice. "ETA 6 minutes. Do you need support?" Danielle paused, eyes scanning the street. "No, not yet. But make sure the body cam request is logged. Understood. She ended the call and slowly turned back to Holt. The sheriff will be here shortly, she said. I suggest you prepare your explanation carefully. Holt looked like a man trying to rebuild a house in the middle of a fire. Every word he considered saying fell apart before it reached his lips. You didn't tell me who you were, he finally muttered. Danielle raised an eyebrow. And if I hadn't been Director Monroe, what would have happened tonight? It wasn't a question. It was a mirror. And Holt saw the answer in it. Ugly, inescapable. The cruiser's lights still flashed behind them, red, blue, a rhythm that once symbolized protection, now just an echo of abuse. Neighbors had started to gather. Porch lights blinked on like eyes widening. A young couple stood by their mailbox, murmuring quietly. A jogger had stopped completely, pretending to stretch while not so subtly filming with his phone. Holt saw them all, but the most damning thing wasn't the crowd. It was his own body cam, quietly blinking red from his vest, recording, documenting, chronicling his fall from assumed righteousness. Danielle glanced at it, then back at him. You know that footage will be reviewed. He said nothing. 5 minutes passed, each one a lifetime for Officer Holt. Then the low growl of tires approached from the far end of the block. A dark sheriff's SUV rolled to a stop behind the cruiser. Out stepped Sheriff Thomas Bryant, mid-50s, crisp uniform, with the gait of a man who'd seen too many of these calls end the wrong way. He looked first at Danielle, then at Holt, then at the scene as a whole, reading the air like a battlefield medic assessing damage before applying pressure. Evening, he said, voice firm but measured. Can someone tell me what exactly is going on here? Before Holt could stammer out a sentence, Danielle stepped forward. Sheriff Bryant. Danielle Monroe, Director of the FBI. His eyes flickered, but to his credit, they didn't widen. I'm aware of who you are, Director, he said. Danielle nodded. Then I won't need to explain why this stop was not only illegal, but dangerous. Bryant turned his eyes to Holt. Officer, is there a reason you initiated this traffic stop? Holt swallowed. She fit a description. Bryant's voice dropped. Of what? A woman driving home? No answer. Danielle folded her arms, not in defense, but in defiance of the expectation that she would simply let this go. I asked him for a reason, she said. He gave me none. I gave him my license and registration. That wasn't enough. He asked for ID. I refused, within my rights. He then placed his hand on his weapon. A pause. Do you deny any of that, Officer Holt? Holt's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. I didn't know who she was. Bryant's eyes darkened. And that's your defense? Danielle didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence was doing the work. Finally, Bryant turned back to her. Director, would you like to file a formal complaint? Danielle looked past the badge, the gun, the authority, and into the man himself. I will, she said softly, but I'd like to do it in person. At the station, with everything on record, including the body cam footage. Bryant nodded. Understood. We'll handle this thoroughly. He turned to Holt. You're dismissed from patrol for the evening. Report to Internal Affairs first thing in the morning. Holt stood still for a second, then walked slowly back to his cruiser, the weight of failure dragging at his feet. As he pulled away, Danielle watched the lights fade into the dark, like a warning light flickering out, not because the danger had passed, but because it had finally been seen. Sheriff Bryant turned toward her again. "Thank you for remaining composed, Director." Danielle offered a thin smile. "Composure is often all we're allowed to keep." He said nothing to that, because what else could be said? By sunrise, the story had already traveled farther than Officer Holt ever imagined. It started with a jogger's phone, discreetly tilted at just the right angle to catch the badge, the gun, the trembling restraint in a black woman's voice. No screaming. No violence, just calm defiance and the unmistakable sound of a system unraveling under its own weight. That clip hit the local forums first, then Reddit, then TikTok, then the Lexington Morning News. Within 6 hours, it had crossed state lines. Within 12, it had a headline on CNN. FBI director pulled over, escalated by officer, Lexington PD under fire. In a town where the biggest scandal last year was a stolen pumpkin from the fall fair, this was a tectonic shift. City Hall phones rang non-stop. The mayor's office issued a carefully worded statement of concern. The police chief postponed 2 speaking engagements and locked his office door. And inside the Lexington Police Department, the temperature dropped by 10 degrees. Not physically, but morally. Because nothing chills a precinct faster than the knowledge that someone got caught doing exactly what everyone knew was happening. Behind closed doors, the panic-began officer Travis Holt didn't return to patrol that day. Instead, he sat in a small windowless room inside the Internal Affairs Division, his face pale, his voice low. "I didn't know she was the FBI director," he repeated over and over, as if ignorance of rank erased abuse of power. But it didn't. The body cam footage was already under review. So was the dash cam. So were the logs from dispatch. So was the recording of Danielle's own call to the sheriff's office, a call that was both surgical and devastating in its clarity. Meanwhile, across town, Danielle Monroe sat in her guest suite at the governor's residence. She hadn't requested special treatment, but after the incident, Governor Natalie Kerr personally insisted. "You're not safe at a hotel right now," the governor had said. "Not because you're vulnerable, but because you're visible." Danielle didn't argue. She wasn't angry. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't even tired. She was something else. Resolute. Because for all her years in the Bureau, for all the secrets and intel she'd held, nothing was as clear as what she saw in Holt's eyes that night. He didn't fear the law until he realized it might apply to him too. Then came the cameras. By mid-afternoon, Sheriff Thomas Bryant stood in front of the press with the weight of a county on his shoulders. Dozens of microphones, flashing lights, reporters firing questions like rubber bullets. But his opening statement was calm, direct, unavoidable. Last night, Director Danielle Monroe, head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, was stopped by one of our officers during a routine patrol. That officer's conduct was inappropriate, escalatory, and inconsistent with the values this department claims to uphold. A pause. Deep breath. "We are launching a full investigation. The body cam footage will be released, and I personally apologize to Director Monroe and to every citizen who saw themselves in her place." The clip of that apology went viral within the hour. Because it wasn't just about a woman in a blazer. It was about every black driver who had ever been asked to prove they belonged. Every polite refusal was labeled as resistance. Every lawful question was mistaken for insubordination. Social media didn't just watch, it responded. Hashtags flooded the feed. Were stopped while black, Danielle Monroe, Power Meets Prejudice. Reform Lexington PD civil rights organizations issued statements of support. ACLU lawyers offered their services. Activists called for suspension, then resignation, then restructuring. But the most powerful voices weren't public figures, they were neighbors. mothers. Veterans, high school teachers, people who began posting their own stories about run-ins with Lexington PD, some eerily similar to Danielle's, minus the FBI badge. I was pulled over last summer, said my plates looked too clean, didn't realize that was probable cause. My 17-year-old son was told to watch his attitude because he asked if he could call me. My father's a judge, still got called boy. And suddenly, the Danielle Monroe story wasn't isolated anymore. It was a pattern, a mirror, and no one could claim they didn't see it. Inside the department, loyalties fractured. Some officers defended Holt behind closed doors, muttering phrases like, "he didn't know," or "this is being blown out of proportion." But others were quiet, reflective. A few spoke privately with Sheriff Bryant. One sergeant even admitted, "I've seen Holt do it before. It just never made the news." That's the thing about power. It protects itself until it can't. And on this day, it couldn't. Because this time, it didn't just touch a civilian. It touched a system that knew how to fight back. Danielle didn't go quietly, either. That evening, she stood before the cameras herself. Not to express outrage, but to demand change. "I did not identify myself as the FBI director because I wanted to be treated as a citizen," she said. And I was. That's the problem. Her eyes didn't blink. Her voice didn't waver. "I am not seeking punishment for one man. I am seeking accountability from a system that makes that kind of man possible." And then, softly but deliberately, "I ask you to imagine, if he'd done this to me, what has he done to those with no badge, no title, no national attention to protect them?" The room went silent, because no one had an answer. The room wasn't made for television. No mahogany panels. No state seals are embossed on the walls. Just beige walls, buzzing fluorescent lights, and a long oval table cluttered with files, coffee cups, and expressions that belonged to people realizing this was no longer just about damage control. It was 7:05 a.m. Sheriff Thomas Bryant stood at the head of the table, not as a man in command, but as one finally understanding the limits of command. To his right, the city's police chief, face stiff, jaw locked in perpetual defense. To his left, the mayor's public safety advisor, glasses off, thumb pressed hard against her temple. Around the table sat internal affairs, 2 city attorneys, a crisis communications consultant, and, dialed in via secure line, a representative from the U.S. Department of Justice. They were no longer meeting to protect themselves. They were meeting because the country was watching. "This isn't just a PR storm," Bryant opened. "It's a reckoning." No one argued. The video had gone viral in over 30 countries. 3 national senators had tweeted about it. And now there were whispers of a federal inquiry into systemic practices at Lexington PD. A federal inquiry. Not just because of the stop, but because the stop wasn't shocking anymore. It was familiar. And familiarity was now evident. "Officer Holt is suspended," the chief announced flatly, "pending the results of the investigation." "Suspended?" The DOJ voice echoed through the speakerphone. "You do realize we're past that. There are 36 pending complaints attached to that name. This wasn't his first escalation. It's just the first time he picked the wrong target." No one corrected her, because she was right. They pulled up the data internal affairs, slid forward a printed spreadsheet, rows of traffic stops, most marked justified, some dismissed, others simply closed without further action. But the pattern screamed louder than the words. Stops are initiated disproportionately in black neighborhoods. Failure to comply citations skewed by race. Body cam footage missing from key incidents. And then, one file in particular. A 17-year-old boy was stopped, handcuffed, and left on the sidewalk for 40 minutes. No arrest, no report. Just a warning. When asked why, Holt had written, "attitude." Now that word sat at the center of the table like a stain. "We have two choices," Bryant said, finally. "Circle the wagons, or open the gates." It was a rare moment of clarity, not because he didn't understand the politics, but because he finally understood the cost of pretending things were fine. "If we protect him," he continued, "we lose the city. If we bury it, it gets dug up again. If we minimize it, we multiply it." The room was still. Then the mayor's advisor spoke. "We need to get ahead of this." "No," Bryant replied. "We need to get honest." The counterattack didn't come with sirens. It came with spreadsheets, with subpoenas, with quiet phone calls to state agencies that were no longer optional. First, a citywide audit of all stops and arrests in the last 5 years. Second, an independent review board chaired by civil rights experts and community leaders with subpoena power. Third, mandatory training. Yes, but not the kind with PowerPoints and box checking. These would be designed with lived experience, reviewed by trauma-informed professionals, and made public. And last, a formal invitation was sent to Danielle Monroe herself to co-lead the review process, not just as a guest, but as a partner. Someone in the room shifted uncomfortably. "What if she declines?" someone asked. Bryant answered without hesitation. "Then we do it anyway." But we offer, because this isn't about saving face, it's about becoming worthy of accountability. He didn't need to explain what that meant, because for the first time, they weren't talking about optics. They were talking about integrity. Meanwhile, outside the war room, the public narrative had already shifted, not from anger to calm, but from shouting to structure. People weren't just demanding Holt's termination anymore. They were demanding systemic exposure. A full name of those who let him thrive, of those who ignored the complaints. Why did it take a woman with a federal badge for anyone to care? At a nearby high school gym, a town hall was being set up. Folding chairs. Microphones. But this time, no panel of police. Instead, pastors, teachers, and young organizers. They didn't want press conferences. They wanted answers. Danielle received the call at 9:43 a.m. "Sheriff Bryant," voice firm but deliberate. "Director Monroe, I want to formally invite you to join our independent review board." She didn't respond right away, not out of hesitation, but because she knew what the request meant. Not a favor, not a performance, but an invitation to step inside the very room from which she had once been targeted. "Sheriff," she said finally, "I'll consider it. But let me be clear, this isn't about cleaning optics. This is about rebuilding trust. And trust doesn't begin with policy. It begins with truth. And truth, she knew, always had a cost. But something was different, now not safer. Not resolved, but possible. For the first time in years, Danielle saw what could happen when a system was forced to stop spinning long enough to see what it had become. The war room was no longer just a command center, it was a confession booth. And outside those walls, a nation was listening. It didn't happen all at once. Systems rarely collapse in public. They crack in private, in break rooms, inboxes, and quiet car rides home. And over the next week, the Lexington Police Department began to sound different. Not because of policy, but because of conscience. It started with a memo anonymous, 2 paragraphs, sent to Internal Affairs and CC'd, strategically, to local media. "I have served with Officer Holt. I've witnessed his tone toward young black drivers shift the moment he exits his cruiser. I stayed silent for too long. I won't anymore? No name, no rank, just enough truth to make silence uncomfortable. The media didn't publish it at first, but the department felt it. Like a cold draft through a window, long believed sealed shut. By morning, 2 more anonymous statements appeared. By the end of the week, there were 11. 1 came from a field training officer, 1 from a desk sergeant, and most notably, 1 from a retired captain who had worked 3 years alongside Holt and now lived out of state. We saw the red flags. We called them personality quirks. That's not what they were. They were violations in waiting. The internal culture was beginning to fold. There was a time when officers feared speaking out more than they feared wrongdoing itself. But now, the fear had shifted. Not toward retaliation, but toward accountability. They could no longer escape. One detective, long respected in the force, asked to speak privately with Sheriff Bryant. "I'm not here to defend Holt," he began, voice low. "But I need to say this. We've all seen it, and not just from him." He paused, cleared his throat. "I've said things, ignored things. I thought I was just keeping the peace." But peace built on silence isn't peace. It's permission. Bryant said nothing. Because what could he say to a man who was finally telling the truth, even if it came years too late? In the academy, a new lesson plan emerged. Captain Maria Juarez, one of the few women of color in a senior training role, requested to overhaul the community engagement curriculum. "It's not enough to teach de-escalation techniques," she told the command board. "We need to teach emotional self-awareness, cultural humility, and most importantly, accountability as a survival skill, not a threat." Her proposal included mandatory workshops with community panels, not lectures, but conversations. Role-play scenarios are reviewed not by supervisors, but by civilian review boards. A rotation of guest speakers, including civil rights historians and formerly incarcerated citizens. And at the bottom of her memo, 1 line in bold. "If officers are trained to use force before they're trained to understand bias, then we're not training protectors, we're training liabilities." There was pushback. But there was also momentum. Industry insiders began to speak up nationally. Something had shifted. In Chicago, a former lieutenant published an op-ed titled, "The Problem Isn't the Badge. It's the silence around it." In Dallas, a police psychologist went viral after saying in a podcast, "Some of the most dangerous people I've evaluated wear the cleanest records. Because suppression isn't reform, it's delayed." Even the National Association of Chiefs of Police, an organization not known for rapid reform, issued a public statement. Lexington's incident is a reminder that training is not enough. Culture eats training for breakfast. It's time to clean house from the inside. Back in Lexington, Danielle watched it all unfold. From her temporary residence, she followed the updates with a kind of emotional detachment that only survivors understand. Not cold. Just measured. She saw the news segments, read the headlines. But what she listened to most were the quiet voices, the ones that didn't trend on Twitter but rippled across institutional walls. A young black officer wrote her an email. "I joined the force hoping to change it from within, but I've been afraid to speak. Watching you stand still in the face of a gun gave me the courage I'd been too ashamed to admit I lacked." A white veteran sergeant messaged her privately. "I've trained 3 officers like Holt. At least one of them is now a detective. That keeps me up at night. I'm ready to testify if it ever comes to that." And then, perhaps most unexpectedly, a civilian clerk sent a handwritten letter. "I process internal complaints. I've seen which ones get buried. I know how many are filed by black citizens that never even make it into review. Please, keep going." Danielle didn't respond to all of them, but she read every word, because this was what real reform looked like, not sweeping policy or headline resignations, but individual awakenings. And when enough people awaken, the system has no choice but to open its eyes. By the end of the month, the Lexington PD had launched its first internal truth audit. A dozen officers voluntarily requested transfers out of patrol units they no longer trusted. 3 resignations came in without a word, and for the first time in the department's 117-year history, a civilian oversight board was granted full disciplinary recommendation authority. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a reckoning, one decision at a time, one confession at a time. One shift, inward. Danielle Monroe knew this wasn't justice, not yet, but it was motion. And sometimes that's how empires fall, not with a bang, but with a whisper. From the inside, Danielle Monroe was no longer just the director of the FBI, no longer just the woman who stood her ground on a quiet Lexington street. She had become a mirror held up to every police department, every courtroom, every airport gate and traffic stop where silence once covered abuse like fresh paint on a rotting wall. The hearing chamber was packed. Cameras lined the back. Staffers lined the walls, and in the center, a long desk with a microphone was waiting for her. She didn't wear her uniform. She didn't bring a security detail. She walked in alone, dressed in dark gray, with a single binder in hand. No flash. No dramatics, just presence. Because sometimes being seen is the most radical act of all. The chairman spoke first. "Director Monroe, thank you for being here. I know the circumstances of your testimony were not ones you asked for." Danielle offered a slight nod. "I didn't ask," she replied, "but I'm here all the same." He gestured for her to proceed. She opened the binder. Then I closed it again and looked straight ahead, not at the committee, but through them, beyond the wood and microphones, toward the country watching. "I wasn't pulled over because I was a threat," she began. "I was pulled over because I was inconvenient." A ripple moved through the room. I was inconvenient to a man whose power had never been questioned. Inconvenient because I didn't look nervous. Inconvenient because I didn't lower my voice. Inconvenient because I didn't fit the story he had already written in his head. She paused. And that's the thing about power. It doesn't always need you to be dangerous. It just needs you to be different. She let that sentence land, then continued. "I've led international investigations. I've briefed presidents. I've had tea with kings and faced threats most Americans will never hear about. But nothing prepared me for what it felt like to have a gun almost drawn on me, not because of who I am, but because he didn't know who I was. And that," she said, voice steady, "is exactly the problem." The chamber was silent, not out of politeness. But the truth is loudest when it's undeniable. Danielle continued. "What happened to me made national news. But what happens to thousands of Black Americans every year doesn't. Because they don't carry a federal badge, they don't have the right title, they don't have the benefit of visibility. They are stopped, questioned, arrested. Some never make it home, and their names don't trend. Their stories don't go viral. Their truths die quietly." Her voice didn't rise. Her hands didn't tremble. But every word landed like a warning bell in the bones. This nation has changed, but not enough. Yes, the officer was suspended. Yes, there are new training protocols. Yes, some departments are reviewing their policies. But none of that matters if we only react when the victim holds power. She looked up, eyes sharp. What we need now isn't just reform. We need memory. The room tilted slightly at that word. She leaned forward. Reform fades, policy shifts. Budgets change, but memory, if we hold on to it, becomes accountability. Remember what it felt like to watch that footage, not the fear, not the anger, but that cold, sinking clarity. This is how fragile dignity can be when authority is unchecked. Then she said something no one expected. I don't want revenge. She said it plainly. No dramatics. No embellishment. I want memory. I want a reflection. I want this country to remember how it felt to see a federal officer treated like a suspect simply for being still, being black, and being unafraid. I want departments to remember what it cost them when they ignored complaints. I want citizens to remember that accountability doesn't start in a courtroom. It starts on the sidewalk, in a patrol car, in the tone of a question, in the pause before a command is given. A congresswoman spoke. Then, Director Monroe, what would you like to see happen from this hearing? From us? Danielle turned her gaze to the woman. 3 things, she said. First, fund independent review boards, not just create them. Fund them. Give them teeth. Second, tie federal funding to civil rights audits. If a department has a pattern of abuse, they don't get a blank check. And third, create a national misconduct database. Officers who harm shouldn't be able to move from badge to badge without a trace. A few heads nodded. A few flinched. All listened. Her final words came softly, but carried weight. I was lucky, she said. I had a title that made the system stop and look back at itself. Most people don't. She stood then, not waiting for applause. I'm not here to tell you we're doomed. We're not. But I'm also not here to pretend we're done. She looked toward the cameras. The danger isn't that we forget what happened to me. The danger is that we think it only happened because I was special. She stepped away from the microphone. That's the illusion we can't afford anymore. Outside, the press swarmed. But Danielle didn't stop to answer questions. She moved quietly through the marble halls, the same way she had entered, alone, composed, deliberate. Behind her, the machinery of government stirred. Ahead of her, a hallway opened to sunlight. And somewhere, in a quiet suburban street in Kentucky, a new rookie officer sat in a training room, watching the footage of her traffic stop. For the first time, he didn't see an angry civilian. He saw a leader, a warning, a possibility. And perhaps, just perhaps, a future worth protecting. This wasn't just Danielle Monroe's story. It was a mirror held up to a system that too often chooses silence over reflection, comfort over change, and power over justice. And now, it's yours. If this story moved you, if it made you pause, made you reflect, made you uncomfortable, good. Because of that discomfort, that's where justice begins. Not in courtrooms, not in headlines, but in each decision we make when no one's watching. So we ask you now, not just to remember Danielle's name. Remember every name that never made the news. Every quiet yes officer spoken through fear. Every parent who waited for their child to come home from a routine stop that wasn't so routine. This isn't about one badge. One city, one woman. It's about a country standing at a crossroads between who it says it is and who it's willing to become. So don't just share this story. Start a conversation. Join your local oversight board. Demand body cam access in your community. Push for transparency. Vote like someone's dignity depends on it, because it does. Justice doesn't begin at the top. It begins when ordinary people decide they will no longer be silent, like share, speak up. because no one should need a title to be treated like a human being.